Thank you, Dean. How many of you knew that last song? Oh, a few of you did. That's good. I wasn't so sure, but well done. It's always a good thing to sing about Calvary and all that the Lord has done for us at Calvary. So thanks again, Dean and the team, for leading us this morning in our time of singing. Well, we come this morning to the last section of Mark's Gospel, or chapter 1. The last section of chapter 1, not the whole Gospel. We've got a long way to go yet, a few more weeks yet up our sleeve, but let me remind you that the Gospel of Mark was written to tell us who Jesus is. Who is Jesus Christ? Yesterday I had a knock on my door and a couple of middle-aged ladies were standing there and they tried to tell me what they believed about Jesus. And their view was somewhat different to mine. They tried to tell me that Jesus was a created being. They tried to tell me that Jesus wasn't God. Obviously you can probably guess that it was the Jehovah's Witnesses come knocking. Who else normally knocks on your door on a Saturday morning? Usually them. But they said that Jesus was not God and that he couldn't be God because he couldn't be our ransom if he was God. Think about that. They said that because he is only a man and not God, then he couldn't be a ransom because a ransom needs to be like Adam, and Adam was fully human. Well, when you think about that, the fact that Jesus is fully man as well as fully God is the very reason why he is the only one who is qualified to be our ransom and to pay the price for our sin and to be our substitute. A human could not do that. That's why Jesus, being fully man and fully God, was able to be our substitute and stand in our place instead of us. And so the Jehovah's Witnesses have a completely different view of who Jesus is. And, they have conveniently mistranslated their Bible. They use what they call the New World Translation Bible. So if you look at your translation this morning and it's a New World one, throw it away because it's the wrong one. But they say that Jesus was a created being, as I said. They say he's the highest of God's creation, that he is not God. They say that he did not rise physically from the dead, just spiritually. And they obviously don't believe in the Trinity at all. The Jehovah's Witnesses are a cult. And a couple of weeks ago I told you that they, along with all other false religions, actually have a host of demons cheering them on. And they're sending multitudes of people to hell with their false doctrine. Because if your view of Jesus is wrong, then your view of the gospel is wrong. And if your view of the gospel is wrong, then your view of salvation from sin is wrong. And if there is no remedy for sin, if you've got the wrong salvation message, then you will die in your sin. And if you die in your sin, the Bible tells you that you will spend eternity away from God's presence in a place called hell. And so it's crucial to get the right view of who Jesus is and understand who he truly is. And so as we've been looking at the Gospel of Mark, Mark has been laying before us proof after proof after proof that Jesus is God, that Jesus is also called the Son of God, and that he is the promised Old Testament Messiah, and that he is also our suffering servant, that he is our Savior. And so as we've worked through chapter 1, we've already seen too that Jesus has divine authority. He has divine authority over sin and over Satan and over demons, and he has divine authority to preach the truth, and he has authority over all kinds of sickness. And this morning we're going to see again that Jesus has authority even over the most horrific of diseases that was around in his time, and that is the disease of leprosy. And so we're going to look at the text this morning starting in verse 40 of Mark chapter 1. And this particular event is recorded also in Matthew's Gospel in chapter 8, the beginning of chapter 8. And it's also recorded in Luke chapter 5. But we're going to read it from Mark's Gospel this morning. Beginning in verse 40, it says this. And a leper came to him, that's to Jesus, imploring him, and kneeling said to him, "If you will, you can make me clean." And moved with pity, he stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I will. Be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. And Jesus sternly charged him and sent him away at once and said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, But go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded for a proof to them." But he went out and began to talk freely about it and to spread the news so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but was out in desolate places, and people were coming to him from every quarter. Well, last time we saw that Jesus had been surrounded by crowds, remember, at Peter's house in Capernaum, and Jesus left that town and he went out into a desolate place. He left the crowds back there in Capernaum. He wanted to get a little bit of peace and quiet. And Luke says in his account of this story that this event just happened in one of the cities. We don't know exactly where it was, and it was probably somewhere around the Sea of Galilee, and it seems like there wasn't a crowd around for this particular event that took place. And so we want to unpack this passage, and we're going to see the interaction that happened between Jesus and this leper. And so as we go through it, I think I'll give you a few headings just to help us grasp what's happening in this account. The first thing we want to notice is the leper's condition. The leper's condition. It says there in verse 40, "And a leper came to him." Now, this was actually quite a shocking statement. If you're not familiar with leprosy in biblical times, you will perhaps not understand the significance of that statement. Because lepers were not allowed to gather in close proximity to anyone. And we'll look at that a little bit in a moment. But leprosy was, and it still is, a horrific disease. The leprosy of biblical times is very similar to what they call today Hansen's disease. The symptoms are very similar. It's literally a skin disease. And leprosy, in its most severe form, was the most feared disease of the ancient world. And it brought with it a social stigma, a little bit like today, if somebody has HIV, it brings with it a social stigma. That was true of leprosy. But thankfully today, leprosy can be kept under control by proper medication. I was just reading during the week, actually, that the World Health Organization, they have supplied for the last 15 years like free medication to countries that have been trying to care for those with leprosy. And apparently they're going to provide for another 5 years that free medication as well. And so that medication has been able to reduce the number of chronic illnesses or cases all around the world. Back in the 80s, I think they said there was just millions of people who had leprosy. And these days, though, that number has reduced considerably to thousands and thousands, not millions. There's about 16 countries, I think they say, around our planet that still have a lot of people with leprosy. And over half of those known cases of leprosy are in India. That's where most lepers are found today. Some of you will be familiar with Colleen Reddit, who's a New Zealander, who's a missionary in India. Well, she works amongst the lepers, and in her last prayer newsletter, she asked specifically that people would pray for her as she went out and cared for these people, not only for their physical health, but also for their spiritual health. Well, in the first century, even more so than today, leprosy was very easily caught. You could pass it on maybe by sneezing or by contacting with a person's nasal drops. And leprosy was just a horrible disease to contract. It would attack a person's nerves. As I said, it was a skin disease, and it would, in severe cases, it would just be not very pleasant to look at. Lepers would get these spongy tumor-like swellings that would grow on their skin, and they would grow all over their faces and over their bodies. And as the disease began to spread, it would even begin to affect their internal organs, and sometimes it would affect their bones as well. And if it was untreated, then that particular leper was vulnerable to many other diseases, tuberculosis and those kinds of things. In the Bible, or in the Old Testament, God gave his people strict instructions and specific regulations to Moses regarding leprosy, and in order to protect his people. We won't do it this morning, but you could go home and read Leviticus chapter 13 and chapter 14, and those two chapters speak specifically about leprosy and how the nation of Israel was to deal with it. And in those verses, you read about a whole lot of tests and a whole lot of examinations that the priests were to perform. It's almost like the priests were kind of like the doctors back then. They were the ones who would diagnose the disease, and they would diagnose the symptoms, and then they would prescribe the required action. And so anybody who was suspected of having leprosy was taken to the priest for an examination. And if the patient showed signs of having more than just a superficial skin problem, then that person was isolated for 7 days. And if those symptoms after 7 days grew worse, they were isolated for another 7 days. And if at that time the rash had not spread further, after those 2 periods of 7 days, the person was considered clean and they could go home. But if the rash had continued to spread, then the person was pronounced unclean. And if a person just went to the priest and it was pretty obvious that they had leprosy because their hair had turned white and their flesh was swollen and it was raw, and if it was pretty obvious at that moment when they first went, then the priest would pronounce that person unclean on the spot, and there was to be no isolation period whatsoever. And so whenever a person was found to have this serious form of leprosy, they had to tear their clothes, and they had to keep their head uncovered, but they had to keep their mouth covered to prevent spreading the disease. And the person who was diagnosed with leprosy was to go around calling out, unclean, unclean, so people knew to stay clear of them. It was a miserable disease for anybody to have. The Jewish people had like 61 defilements, a whole list of these defilements. And leprosy was second only to that of a dead body in seriousness. In fact, people would say that lepers were actually considered to be walking corpses. That's how bad it was. And so lepers were legally forbidden to live within the community of the people. And there were some Jewish rules that were made, not found in the Bible, but the Jewish rules said that you must remain at least 6 feet away from a leper. And if the wind's blowing, then if the wind's blowing down towards you, then you need to increase that distance to 150 feet so that the disease would potentially not spread to you. Let me read you just from a book that a guy wrote about leprosy called the book Unclean, Unclean. He says this, he says, the disease which we today call leprosy generally begins with pain in certain areas of the body. And then he says numbness follows. And soon the skin in such spots loses its original color. It gets to be thick and glossy and scaly. As the sickness progresses, the thickened spots become dirty sores and ulcers due to the poor blood supply. And the skin, especially around the eyes and the ears, begins to bunch with deep furrows between the swellings, so that the face of the afflicted individual begins to resemble that of a lion. Fingers drop off or are absorbed. Toes are affected similarly. Eyebrows and eyelashes drop out. And by this time, one can see the person is this pitiable condition. The person in this pitiable condition is a leper. By a touch of the finger, one can also feel it. One can even smell it, for the leper emits a very unpleasant odor. Moreover, in view of the fact that the disease-producing agent frequently also attacks the vocal cords, the leper's voice acquires a grating quality. His throat becomes hoarse, and you can now not only see, feel, and smell the leper, but you can hear his rasping voice. I mean, a pretty horrible description of what happens to somebody who has this disease. One ancient rabbi said this. He said, when I see lepers, I throw stones at them, lest they come close to me. Another one said this. He said, I would not so much as eat an egg that was purchased on a street where a leper had walked. So it was pretty tough to be living in that culture, and even in today's culture if you have leprosy. One of the interesting facts that quote I just read you said about leprosy is that it's not normally painful in its advanced stages because of the nerve damage that happens. And that doesn't seem so bad, because most people are afraid of diseases because of the pain and the discomfort that they cause. And so you might ask the question, well, what makes a painless disease so horrible? Well, doctors who specialize in this illness and the treatment of leprosy say that it is a cruel disease because it acts like an anesthetic, numbing the pain cells in the person's hands and in their feet and their ears and in their eyes. And so injury and decay occurs because of this numbing effect. And the destruction of the body parts happens because the warning system of pain has gone. A person with this disease can feel no pain. And so it was common for lepers to sometimes put their hands or feet too close to the fire without realizing it. And they would hold on to sharp objects that they didn't realize were harming them. And sometimes they would walk on dangerous objects and maybe even twist their ankles and that kind of thing. But they couldn't feel the pain, so they didn't realize the damage that they were doing to themselves. You know, I find it interesting that we often think of pain as something bad. But it's not. It's actually helpful, because pain is God's warning system for us to tell us that something's wrong and that we need to do something about it. And so we meet this leper. This leper comes to Jesus, and in Luke's account, Luke was a doctor, remember, he explains his condition like this. He says that this man was full of leprosy. He obviously had a chronic case of leprosy. And so let's keep looking at the passage here and notice what happens when this leper comes to Jesus. He comes to him with a certain amount of confidence. As he comes to Jesus, it says in verse 40, the leper came to him, imploring him. I mean, this leper is obviously not afraid of Jesus. He had undoubtedly heard about Jesus and his ability to heal, and somehow he must have heard about the love of Jesus, the compassion of Jesus, because Jesus had already shown that to so many people inflicted with sicknesses. And so this man comes with confidence, and he knew full well that he wasn't allowed to associate with non-lepers. But he also knew that there was something significant, something special about this man, Jesus. And so even though he risked the possibility of being reprimanded or maybe even stoned for his actions, he laid all those thoughts and those fears aside, and he came to Jesus with confidence. And notice what he does. He comes to him imploring him, but then it says that he comes in reverence here. He's kneeling down before him. Matthew tells us in his gospel that this man bowed down. Luke says that he fell on his face before Jesus. And so on the outside, this man was ugly and scarred. He was unclean, but on the inside, he seems to come to Jesus at this point anyway with some kind of worshipful attitude, with an attitude of reverence. And Matthew's account even said that this man came to Jesus and called him Lord. Lord, if you're willing. He didn't call him rabbi, he didn't call him teacher, he didn't call him Jesus, he called him Lord, which is a significant title. He knew there was something different about Jesus. Perhaps he knew that Jesus was the Messiah. Perhaps he knew that Jesus was God who possessed almighty power. He certainly knew that he was coming into the presence of a significant person and could therefore be healed by him. So he comes with this reverent attitude. He comes with an attitude of humility as well. He says to Jesus, if you will, if it's your will that I be healed. He didn't demand that Jesus heal him. There's a sense of humility that he has. He asks Jesus to heal him, only if it be his will. It's kind of like the leper arrives there and he sees Jesus and he says to him, I know I don't matter that much. I know that other men will flee from me and have nothing to do with me. I know that I have no claim on you, but perhaps out of your divine love and mercy, you will show your power to even somebody like me. He came with that type of attitude. It almost seems like the leper was willing to actually remain a leper if that was what the Lord's will was. Obviously, he wanted to be healed, but he was willing to follow what the Lord's will was. He certainly just acknowledged that Jesus had the power and the ability to heal him. And so his first concern wasn't necessarily his own, but his first concern was the Lord's will and his glory. And to be honest, sometimes God's will for us is to suffer and to go through trials, because God uses those things to mature us, to strengthen our faith. But the leper also knew that Jesus had miraculous power, and so he said to him, you can make me clean. He had absolute belief that Jesus could heal him of his disease. And I mean, imagine being there, if you could be there, if you can imagine it, and seeing this all unfold. You know, this leper arrives, he probably looks pretty ghastly, but this leper comes with an attitude of confidence and reverence and humility, and he has this strong belief that Jesus can cleanse him. That's the leper. That's his condition. Well, let's look at the next thing. That is the Lord's compassion. The Lord's compassion. Look at verse 41. It says, moved with pity, he stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, I will be clean. My version of the Bible, which is the ESV version, says moved with pity. If you've got a New American Standard Bible or a King James Bible, I think it'll say that Jesus was moved with compassion. If you've got an NIV out there this morning, you might look at your verse and think, well, that doesn't say anything like that in my Bible. It says in the NIV that Jesus was indignant, that Jesus was filled with anger. And the reason for that is that the NIV translation of this verse is based on a slightly different manuscript, and so it's a completely different word that gets translated here. And for that translation where it talks about Jesus being angry, commentators would say that Jesus wasn't angry at the leper, but that he was angry at the fact that he saw the sin, which was the result of leprosy was the result of sin, and so he was angry at kind of sin and Satan and the reason why this man had leprosy. But like I said, the ESV, the NASB, the King James has the translation moved with compassion, which is what the translation that I would lean towards. And notice what happens. Moved with compassion, Jesus stretches out his hand and touched him. Think about that. Jesus was a Jew. And guess what? Jews were forbidden by the Mosaic law to touch a leper because lepers were unclean. And so to touch a leper was to expose yourself to physical and ceremonial uncleanliness. You would contaminate yourself if you touched a leper. And so Jews were not to touch lepers. If they did, they could only bring harm to themselves. But I like what Ferrer says in his commentary. He says this. He says, the hand of Jesus was not polluted by touching the leper's body, but the leper's whole body was cleansed by the touch of the holy hand. And that's exactly what happened. You know, it's interesting because Jesus could have healed this man by just speaking a word. He could have healed this man by just thinking about it. But Jesus chose to touch this man. And he reaches out and he touches him as an act of love and an act of compassion. I mean, don't miss the significance of that point, that Jesus would touch the untouchable, that he would reach out and touch this person who was an outcast in that community. Jesus showed love and acceptance and mercy and compassion towards this guy. And notice what happens next. The next thing we'll see is the leper's cleansing. Verse 42. Or notice what Jesus said at the end of verse 41. He says, I will be clean. And then, so Jesus speaks to this leper and he uses an authoritative commanding voice. And notice what it says here in verse 2. It says, and immediately the leprosy left him and he was made clean. Did you notice how long it took him to heal this man? It only took like 3 days and 2 visits to the miracle tent and a truckload of faith, right? Not quite. This man was healed instantly, immediately. There was no doubt that this guy had been healed. There was no delay. And Mark uses that favorite word that he uses all the way through the Gospel of Mark, the word immediately. Immediately, this leprosy departed the man. Instantaneously, complete healing. The leprosy was completely gone. He was fully cleansed. And as I said earlier, I don't think there was a big crowd. There wasn't a big audience for this healing. But can you imagine being there? Just imagine seeing this happen. To see this leper, this man who was deformed, shriveled, scaly, sore, covered man. Just seeing him stand upright with perfect arms and perfect legs, and now with his face smooth and unscarred, his hair restored, his voice normal, his eyes bright again. Imagine seeing that happen. Pretty spectacular. Well, this was an amazing miracle, and it was an awesome display of God's power, God's authority, Christ's authority in this man's life. The leper was now clean. He was unclean, but now he's been cleansed. He was an enemy in his society, but now he can be welcomed back as a friend. He was separated, but now he can be completely restored. I mean, what a change. Imagine being that man. I mean, imagine the joy. Imagine the excitement, the relief that this man would have experienced, that he had just had an amazing miracle happen in his life. Well, it's interesting to see what happens next. Look what Jesus said, and we see the Lord's charge here. Number 4, the Lord's charge in verses 43 and 44. It says that Jesus sternly charged him and sent him away at once. Said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded for a proof to them." I mean, this seems a little bit unusual, right, when you think about it. Jesus gives this man a strong warning. In my version says this is like a stern charge that happens. Jesus gives this guy a set of instructions to obey. Jesus sends the leprosy away, and then Jesus is about to send the cleansed leper away. And he sends him away with 3 instructions. He says, don't tell anyone. Go and see the priest, and then follow the Old Testament process of cleansing for a leper. And you might ask the question, well, why did he need to see the priest? Well, he needed to see the priest because that was the Old Testament requirement. Jesus was simply just upholding the law of God, the Mosaic law. If somebody believed that they had been healed or had overcome their leprosy, it had to be confirmed by the priest. Remember, the priest was sort of like the doctor, and he would do the examination. That was the biblical process that you had to follow in Leviticus 14. And so it was the priest who would officially pronounce that somebody was clean after they had had an inspection. And if you were shown to be cleansed, then you would be considered clean. And so if you read through Leviticus 14, it would give you all of the details of what they had to do. It's a little bit strange. It's all a little bit symbolic, I think. But they had to grab a couple of birds, and one of the birds they had to kill. And with the blood of that bird would be dripped on the other bird, and then it would be dripped on the leper. And then the person who was involved, they had to wash their clothes. They had to shave their hair. They had to take a bath. They had to stay in a tent outside the city for a week, just while they were testing to see if it had gone. And then after that week, that process would be repeated. They had to have another shave, another bath, and the priest would inspect them. And then not only that, they had to bring appropriate offerings to the priest, and it was to bring a couple of lambs as offerings to the priest. And if he passed all of the tests, the priest would announce him to be clean, and he would be welcomed back into society. And so that was the process that he needed to go through. And Jesus also, I think, wanted the leper to go to see the priest because he wanted to prove to the priest that something significant was happening in the nation of Israel at this particular time. Jesus is in Israel. He's in the northern part of Israel, up in Galilee, up by the Sea of Galilee. And the priests are where? Do you remember where they are? Down here in Jerusalem, right? They're at the temple in Jerusalem. And so Jesus is effectively saying to this leper, I want you to take a 100-kilometer journey down to Jerusalem, to the temple, to the priest in the temple, and I want you to present yourself to him. Because if this leper did that, that would speak volumes to that priest who was one of the religious leaders in the land. This was an undeniable miracle. The priest would look at this man and know something significant was going on, and know that there was a man who was quite significant in the country at that time. And no doubt this leper, if he went down to see the priest, would take some friends and take some family with him, and they would give evidence and prove that the miracle had actually happened. And so he was supposed to go off and do those things. But what actually happened, Did he obey? No, he didn't, did he? Look at verse 45. This is what I call the leper's crime. Had to keep the alliteration going, okay? So, the leper disobeyed. He, in fact, did the exact opposite to what Jesus requested him. Look at what it says in verse 45. But he went out and he began to talk freely about it and to spread the news so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but was out in desolate places, and people were coming to him from every quarter. And so this guy couldn't help himself. He goes into the town and he completely disregards what Jesus said to him, and he tells everybody. He disobeys Jesus. And in doing so, he not only violated the Old Testament law, but he ruined Jesus' ability to enter into a town without a massive crowd coming to see him. And as a result, the crowds just kept on coming to Jesus, and they kept on coming to Jesus because they wanted healing themselves. And it was distracting to the ministry that Jesus truly wanted to do, and that was to preach the word to the people and to preach the gospel. Remember, that's why he left Capernaum in last week's passage. He left a bunch of people in Capernaum unhealed because Jesus' purpose was not to heal them, but to preach the gospel. That was his priority. And so this cleansed leper, he got what he wanted. He got the healing. But he proceeded to do the exact opposite of what Jesus told him to do. And that, my friends, is not a wise decision. It is never an appropriate time to disobey Jesus. No matter how excited you are about life, no matter what's happened in your life, there is never, ever a right time to disobey Jesus. That is a good lesson for us to remember. So there's a number of things that we've reminded ourselves of in this passage. We've seen again, as Mark has been telling us over and over again, that Jesus has authority and power to heal. And he has that authority because he's God. And he has that authority because he is the Messiah. And the Old Testament predicted that the Messiah would be able to do that. And it's proof that he is the Messiah. That's what Mark's telling us. Jesus is the one that was spoken of in the Old Testament. He's arrived. And as I just said, we've been learning that the miracles were not the priority. The preaching of the gospel was the priority. Even though Jesus did miracles and he did healings, which was fantastic, the main reason for him coming was to deal with the sin in the hearts of the people, not the sicknesses in their body. If we miss that point, we miss the point of the gospel. The underlying point of physical miracles was to get to the greater need. That was a spiritual healing. Forgiveness of sin is far greater than any physical healing. And, as you think of leprosy, there's some real significant parallels in the story between leprosy and sin. Leprosy is physically destructive. It is ugly. It's horrible. But sin is uglier. Sin is more destructive than leprosy. And so leprosy is a graphic illustration for us of what sin is actually like. Like leprosy, sin infects the whole person, and it's ugly, and it's corrupting, and it's contaminating, and it's alienating, and it's incurable by man. It's been said that there has never been a disease which so separated man from his fellow man as leprosy, but equally, there is nothing more that separates us from God than sin. Leprosy destroys physical health and makes a person an outcast from other people, other men. But sin destroys our spiritual health, and it makes us an outcast with God, which is far, far worse. But you know what the good news is? That just as Jesus can cure leprosy, Jesus can cure sin. And that's the point of the Gospel of Mark. And that's good news. That's great news for all of us, for you and for me. And so Jesus restored that leper with his fellow man by cleansing his sin, but Jesus can restore our relationship to God by forgiving us and cleansing us of the sin that separates us from him. There's there's a lot of spiritual leprosy in our world. There's a lot of sin in our world, in our country, in our nation, in our community, maybe even in the church. But we know the cure. We know the cure. We know it's Jesus Christ. We know He has the power to forgive sin. We know He can wash us clean from our sin. If we confess our sin, the Bible tells us Jesus is willing to forgive it. He can cleanse us from our sin, which is exciting. We just need to be a little bit like the leper in one sense, not all like him, but a little bit. And that when he came to Jesus, he came in humility and with reverence. That's how we ought to come to Jesus, with that same kind of humility and reverence, and come in faith, knowing that Jesus can forgive our sins. And He will if you do that. And for those of us who are saved, for those of us who know Christ, we ought to be thankful, because in many ways we were like that leper, but in a spiritual sense. And so we need to be grateful, we need to be thankful that God has cleansed us of our sin and He's put us in a right standing with Himself, and that's an exciting position to be in. So be thankful for that, and thank the Lord that He's created a new heart within you, and He's called us to be a part of His family. He's forgiven us. That's a wonderful, wonderful privilege. So those are a few lessons we can learn from this passage, and I trust that the Lord would remind us of these things and encourage us with them, and even challenge us. Or maybe if you want to know more about how you can follow Christ, then come and see me, and I'd love to talk to you some more about that. Now, let's bow our heads. We're going to finish with a song. Come on up, team, and let me pray before they come and play. Father, it's just a joy again to remind ourselves of who You are and who Your Son is, and we are so grateful that You have the power and authority over sin and sickness and Satan. And Father, we thank You that we are in a victorious family, Your family. You've won the battle for us, and we're so thankful for that. And so, Father, thank You for these truths that we've been reminded of this morning. Encourage our hearts with them, Lord, as we go out from here today and for this week, as we go to live for You and serve You. Lord, this week I pray that You'd help us to look out for opportunities to show our love and mercy and compassion to others, as we seek to be the light that You want us to be, as we seek to be the ambassadors that You want us to be. Lord, even as we head out to the sound show this coming weekend, Lord, I pray that that would be a great opportunity for us to be able to share what we believe about Christ and all that He can do with our community, and show love and compassion to them. And Lord, even as I mentioned earlier in the service about this family who are grieving over the loss of their little daughter, Lord, we want to pray for them. I don't think they are a part of Your family at the moment, but Lord, I would certainly pray that somehow through this tragedy in their life, that Your glory would be able to be evident to them. Maybe even through Dean and Jeanette, Lord, I pray that it might be an open window and an opportunity to share with them. Thank You for the friendship that they were able to forge a year or so ago. And so, Lord, we commit that family to You as well for Your blessing, and ask that Your care and compassion would be upon them. So, Lord, thank You for an opportunity now to continue to worship You. May we finish this service giving You glory as we sing this song in Jesus' name.